Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. I know this looks really strange, but what I'm holding here is a catch box, actually a microphone. I'm sure you can hear me. I hope you can. My name is Amy Sullivan, and I'm the Director of Library Services. I'd like to welcome you today. I'm also the co-chair of the One Book Read Committee, and I appreciate you coming out on this not so lovely day outside. I'm glad it's not torrentially downpouring. Anyway, this catch box is going to be used throughout our program today. We're hoping that our audience would like to participate, make comments or questions, and it's real spongy, and you can toss it like that, and we can toss it to each other and just kind of have some fun doing that. But that way we don't have trouble running around trying to get a microphone. So if you would just lightly toss that to a person that might be next in the comments, we would appreciate that. But I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the One Book Read Committee and our panelists today and our moderator, who is Britton Shirley. He's the Dean of our Humanities, Fine Arts, Business, and Social Sciences Division. Before we do get started, I want to remind you that this is one of the events that we've planned as a committee to lead up to the excitement of our One Book Read author visiting in March 12th and 13th. Crystal Wilkinson, of course, is the author of Water Street, and that's what we've all been reading all semester and last semester. We're really excited about her visit, and all of our information is up here on the screen as a reminder. If you don't remember the times and dates of that, we have bookmarks at the entrance. If you'd like to take one that also has all of that information to remind you, please come. Those are free events, and we have a student presentation on the 13th, and we have a community presentation. And faculty and staff, of course, are all welcome on the 12th, the evening of the 12th. So we're excited that she's coming. We cannot wait to meet her. And as you know, our book consists of short stories. It's a short story collection that reads like a novel. We can teach that, and we are teaching that in our classes in different segments and different chapters. We are focusing on just 4 of those stories today for our panel discussion, which revolves around mental health issues. And we have some people that are experienced in that area to talk with us today, so we're very glad to have them. So I would like to introduce Mr. Britton Shirley to talk about our panelists today.
Hello, I'm going to introduce our panelists so we can get this show on the road. I know they've got a lot of good information to share with us today. Our first panelist is Melanie Nunn, and she is a retired educator and assistant minister at Mount Moriah Missionary Baptist Church. Octavia Lawrence is Dean of Students here at WKCTC. Jana Wilson is a counselor for Four Rivers Behavioral Health of Paducah, and she also serves here at WKCTC as a counselor. And then we have Keisha Curry, who is a community social worker with experience in mental health, acquired brain injury, adults with developmental disabilities, and those living with HIV and AIDS. So the first story we're going to talk about today is the opening story of Water Street, and it's called My Girl Mona. And it's a pretty layered and complex story in that it's told from the first person point of view of Yolanda, who is talking to us as readers in the story about a conversation she had with her friend Mona about a conversation she previously had with her psychologist. So you've kind of got 3 layers of narrative going on in this story. But what I really wanted to talk about here on our panel is that as readers, we notice that Yolanda is fixating or dwelling upon certain things throughout her story as she's having lunch with Mona. In y'all's opinion, what did those details reveal to you about Yolanda as a character and the struggles she was having with mental health and panic attacks and things she was experiencing?
I'm going to go first, since I'm in that first position. Yolanda fixates on Mona's physical appearance. She is enthralled with,
That's okay.
she fixates on Mona's physical appearance because she idolizes, worships Mona, her looks, her ability to capture the male species' attention, and it's a revealing of her insecurities. She wants to be Mona, but she can't she doesn't feel she has the looks or the personality to capture as much attention So I think it shows that she is in definite need of, she's attention seeking and she has insecurities.
Uh, I agree with that. I also think that she somehow thinks that Mona is perfect in that she sees Mona as being able to be her authentic self. And I think that that's part of the struggle, is that even when she talks about like her anxiety attacks or her panic attacks, in that she always carries like her opinions and keeps her opinions to herself, and she's not able to really express herself. She sees Mona as someone who is able to do that. And I think there's a level of envy and insecurity because she's constantly comparing herself to Mona.
Which I was going to say, agree with Octavia, because she has insecurities, that does lend to her anxiety attacks. That does lend to her having panic attacks or experiencing those. Oftentimes when individuals are secure in who they are as themselves, they will experience a level of anxiety. In this particular case, she was so asphyxiated, as Melanie has said, she's so asphyxiated on wanting to be someone like someone else, like Mona, she failed to realize that she was really, her own person. She had the ability to be her own individual without being asphyxiated on someone.
I guess that really brings me to my next question. Whether you're educators or counselors or people that work with students, I think we have a lot of people in society that are stressed about a lot of different things. And it might not get to the same point as having panic attacks as the character in the story is. But do you have any practices or coping mechanisms that you would suggest to someone who is struggling with anxiety or panic attacks or things like that of those natures?
In situations of panic attacks, in working with a lot of my clients, I find that if they acknowledge that that's what that is, because the first instance with the heart palpitations and the enclosed throat, you feel as though you're having a heart attack or something's not right. But if you acknowledge, hey, this is a panic attack, and breathe through it, it'll subside. So that's one of the coping mechanisms. And
I was going to say also, even the character in the book used deep breathing and counting as a means of trying to redirect her thought process in order to reduce her anxiety level. Deep breathing is always, clinically, I use deep breathing exercises often, as well as visual imagery, asphyxiating, not on someone, but on an object, until the point where you feel yourself de-escalating, you feel your anxiety level begin to diminish, and then therefore stabilizing yourself in a way where you can function without feeling over elevated or increased levels of anxiety.
Do we have any questions from the audience on this story? All right, we'll move on to the second story for today's discussion. And that story is In Plain Sight. And it's the story of the character of Jeanette. And if you haven't read the book, or if it's been a while since you've read it, in this story, Jeanette's mother undergoes a very serious bout of mental illness after the loss of her husband. And Jeanette, as a character, we see her grow up in that household and then also grow up in the care of a family friend and neighbor. So my question on this really revolves around how Jeanette's mother's mental illness ultimately affects the character of Jeanette. In what ways did you see the mother's mental illness affecting Jeanette as a child, as she was growing up in those formative years and learning how to understand the world? And then how do you ultimately see that affect even Jeanette as an adult, as in this story we see her later on as she's lived past and through these events?
Well, Jeanette has to take on the role of being a mature caregiver she has the burden of really, she is grieving the loss of her father and her mother, but really doesn't have the opportunity to grieve fully. And I think that her having to assume the role of being the mature child in that position, and sort of block out the things that were going on with her mother, just put her in a position where she had to grow up tremendously fast, and not really have an adult in the household that she could bounce things off of or really take on that adult role, and she had to assume that position.
I agree that she did have to grow up a little faster than probably what she was prepared for, but I also think her mother's mental illness haunted her as a child as well as an adult. And as a result, I think Jeanette was just unable to show who she really was because of that haunting. She was always remembering what her mother was like, you know, and I think we're talking earlier about the fact that if there's a mental illness in the family, especially for a female, I think, it may affect us a little differently than a male. We're not so quick we're either going to be extroverts because we don't want to associate with that mental illness of mom, or we become introverts from shame, especially if it's as extreme as Jeanette's case was, and we just don't want people to associate us with that, but it's always in the back of that individual's mind that there is something that is not quite right with my parent, and could that possibly transfer to me? Is it genetic? You know, if you don't seek help, if you don't have help, then you come up with your own solutions as to how you can cope with this situation.
I would like to also mention too, if we would remember, there was a phase where she went to college. She left and she felt that she had the opportunity to be separated from the situation. However, we see that she continues to struggle with her relationships because of being ashamed of her family, of her mother, of what the family has gone through. She never really connected with anyone. I think the author lets us know that she had one date, and when they ask about how's your family, or tell me about your family, she made up a story. She made up a story, and it might be something that she always fantasized about. However, due to the embarrassment of what she's gone through and her family, she chose not to disclose that information. And ultimately, I think it affected her with any relationships that she did have.
And one other thing is that I think it was mentioned in the book that she said her mother showed her pain on the outside, but Jeanette's pain was on the inside. It was internal, and so she had difficulty coping because of that.
I think as much as this story focuses on that relationship between Jeanette and her mother, I also think this is a story about community as well, as much of the book is. And in this story in particular, you know, I think there are some ways in which the community that surrounds Jeanette and her mother offers support in their time of need during this time where they need help with her mental health. But I think there's also ways in which the community fails this family. So I was wondering if you could speak toward the things that you felt the community did well to support Jeanette in this time, and then where they dropped the ball.
Well, I was going to say that well, let's start with the things in which they supported. So I think there were things like that the minister was able to come and make sure that he cut the grass and did the things for the upkeep of the home. There was the lady, I think it was Miss Watkins, that helped her. She provided a place to stay while Jeanette's mother was institutionalized. And so I think there were things that the community did well, but I also think it's important, I can't leave there without providing the context that we are talking about an African American community that is impoverished and really doesn't necessarily know how to deal with mental health. And so I really think a lot of times in communities such as that with low socioeconomic status, people really try to do what they can, but in some cases they just don't know how to be able to help. Considering the time mental health, where we are in Kentucky, mental health is, there's not a lot of money that's put into mental health now. And then particularly when you have communities that are impoverished, you just have people who don't necessarily address that or kind of normalize that behavior. And so I think the support that they provided was what they knew what to do. I'm not really sure that that community had the resources to be able to help in the ways that they could have if they had them.
And I also think you have to consider the setting, the time. In the 70s, there was not a lot of information about mental health, at least for, I can only speak about the African American community. I mean, that's who I am. And so we tended to not openly discuss mental health issues. You don't want people to know that there may be something going on that isn't quite right. Or it's not mental health, it's craziness. So I think the time period had a lot to do with how both Jeanette and Mom and the community responded to the needs of the mother.
Just to go off script a minute here, both of y'all mentioned just the context of time in the setting of this novel and in the African American community. So, roughly, I'm horrible with math. 30 years later, in contemporary time, I would round up, I think. Do you see progress being made in terms of people's willingness to discuss mental health more openly, or not? Do you see more funding and resources being available, or no?
Yes. From a clinician, because I'm a clinician, I know personally that funding is being directed towards mental illness to provide mental health services, especially in rural communities. They're really advocating for clinicians if they are willing to treat or serve in a particular rural area for so many years, the government will pay for their education. So definitely they're making strides in trying to increase and promote awareness in all communities. I would say all communities. I will say this, being here on a college site, I can say that providing events such as this and other events across the community is helping to promote awareness, and people are becoming more accepting of being able to be more open in discussing mental health issues. One thing that I've found, and I believe all my colleagues can state this, is that usually, and when I do FYE presentations, I always discuss adolescents, the population. They're the least likeliest to seek mental health services, primarily because of the stigma that's associated with it. However, if we increase the awareness, I always try to use the example, just like we go to a physician, to a primary care physician, to receive annual exams on an annual basis. We need to have mental health assessments every year. We live in a day and age where there's so many things going on, where anxiety and depression levels are definitely on the rise. I believe we all experience some level of depression and anxiety just naturally. But because of socioeconomic status and cultural differences and just the world in general, society has dictated that those two things are definitely on the rise. But I will say, overall, awareness is and funding is being made available, which is an awesome thing.
I would like to piggyback off of what she said in regards to mental health dollars. Although mental health dollars are increasing, we're behind we're very late in addressing the mental health issues in Kentucky or even the southern states. So I think it's awesome that we do have mental health dollars that are now being put in place, and there's education being provided. I find that in a lot of situations, people who are in authority, like police officers, even firemen, or just community service workers, they are not educated about mental health, so therefore they don't know how to directly deal with a person in a situation or in a case where they're making an arrest or they're trying to rescue a person from a fire. They don't know or they're not aware of that. So I think it's important that mental health is talked about on a normal basis, on a everyday basis, no matter what culture you are. I think every culture struggles with it, and I think there is a stigma behind it across the board. And we need to get to the point where we need to talk about it so we can start healing. Some of our mental health issues we can kind of avoid or cut them off at the path if we had those discussions. So I think that's just really important, and I'm glad she brought that up.
I agree, but I'm going to take it into the area of education. I graduated from college in 1972, long time ago. But one of my issues, and I remember when more children with mental health issues were being allowed to come into the classroom, no longer regulated to special education classrooms. And at that time, there was no, and that was in the late 80s, no preparation from a teacher standpoint on how to deal with children with mental health issues. There's still none today. Unless you are a special education teacher, you are not going to get any education, any classroom management techniques, nothing that's going to assist you in dealing with children with mental health issues. Inclusion is great, but if the teacher does not know how to deal with a child who has special needs, then we have situations that we are seeing more that are more and more prevalent of abuse, just mishandling the entire situation because they're frustrated and they don't know what to do. And I've spoken to legislators about possibly getting some funding for those classes in the colleges and universities, and it's talked about, but no one's put the information on the table to actually provide funding for that.
And I did want to speak to stigma because, and I'm picking on Melanie here, because I was raised by her generation. And that generation, you know, when I think about my parents and people who are in that generation, there was a stigma in terms of you don't go to get counseling. You don't talk to people about what's going on here and things like that. That still exists. We still have people who are being told that they don't need to go and see someone, even though we have resources and things that are available. They are being told, no, that's not what you need to do, because you don't go, what's counseling going to do? What's going to talk to somebody going to do for you? And so I think that it's important that that education is being taught and shared, as Janice said, making sure that we normalize the fact that it's okay to go and talk to someone or share your feelings with someone. But I think we have, you know, just I watched This Is Us, or just This Is Us. Yes, This Is Us. And last night, particularly, they were talking about just how sometimes we are that stoic. We don't want to share our feelings. We don't want to talk about what hurts us or harms us. And I think it's absolutely imperative that we make sure that we go and talk to people before we're in crisis. And so making sure that we're going and sharing those things with people that can help us and that can assist us.
All right, that was a great discussion. Do we have any questions from the audience on any of those points? 0 for 2 for audience participation. You're halfway through, so I expect you to pick this up. All right, the next story is between men, and in this story, it's really the story of Mouse, and it takes place, he is in Cac Simpson's bootleg house, because I believe they're in a dry county, so they're hanging out at Cac Simpson's house. And this story really focuses primarily on Mouse's mental state, but the way in which the dynamic of his home life as a child played into that. Similar to Jeanette, though Mouse had both of his parents still around, living in the house. The mother who doted on him to various degrees, and the father who coped with that in various other degrees. So without spoiler alerts, I was just wondering if y'all could comment a little bit on the way in which Mouse's home life and family dynamic influenced the mental state we see him at the present moment of the story when he's at the bootleg house.
I think as we define family, I don't think Mouse really had a family. They were just people connected by circumstances. The mother spent far too much time obsessing over Mouse. She didn't give him an opportunity to be responsible for his actions. And the father was selfish in the fact that it was only his demands and his needs that he was concerned about. So in terms of how we define family, I don't see them as a family. I just think they were people who were connected by circumstances and just were existing together until they eventually separated, which led to Mouse's misconceptions or his, his distorted perceptions of what it means to be a man and how to operate with other relationships. He was just emulating what he had seen and what his father introduced to him, which was, you're a man because you can hold your alcohol and have multiple relationships with women.
I think a lot of us can relate to the situation. If we look in our small towns, we can relate to a situation similar to this, where there's always going to be what we call that one person. And when I mean by that one person that, if you notice, Mouse said he could be considered an alcoholic. Some might call him an alcoholic. We all find that one particular person in our community. However, Mouse is definitely a product of his environment, of what he was introduced to. So Mouse did exactly what he was taught. Daddy took him to the, we won't call it juke joint or the club or whatever, and showed him, this is what you do as a man. Boy, you too soft. This is what you do. So that's how Mouse thought a man should be. And I'm gonna agree with Melanie, drink, chase women. But then again, you see there's a breakdown in how Mouse receives relationships because he's finding himself single and he's never able to commit. Now, I don't know if that's because of his father's infidelities or his mother's break in how she nurtured him, but we noticed that here in this book. So we want to be careful to look at how relationships affect us as a whole and how environments play a very important part in who we are.
Well, so I think in Mouse's situation, I really don't see him much different than I see Jeanette, because he lost his mother because after the father's infidelity, his mother was a shell of what she was. Same thing with Jeanette, and I think also her father died. Mouse's father was no longer in the house and didn't have a connection. He wanted to have that connection, and he says in that chapter, it talks about how he wanted his dad to come around. He was glad that he was gone, but he still wished for the relationship. and his father never came by or saw him or anything like that. So when you say product of environment, I think it's important to know that even though environments are the same, the results can be drastically different. Yes, Jeanette still didn't have, she had commitment issues, but she was also, someone who was somewhat productive in that she was able to keep a job and she was able to participate in society, not to the fullest, but still able to do that. So I think when I think about them, I think about how a lot of times what happens kind of causes us to have to mature and make decisions that we shouldn't necessarily make as a child. But we have to do that because those circumstances require us to.
And as a result of his upbringing, especially with his father taking him to the juke joint, he was in denial about who he was. On page 66, he says, if you look real close, though, around the eyes, you can always tell a drinking man a mile away, especially if you're one yourself. You can always spot your own kind, even from a distance. And then on the very next page, he says that people would probably say that he was an alcoholic. He's in denial about the fact that he is an alcoholic, but he just admits previously that I can spot my own kind. So he really doesn't know who he is. I think he's just existing and floundering, trying to find his way, which is what he was basically introduced to as a child. So, the book in its totality just kind of shows us how parents have a direct impact on their child's life, and they can destroy their children inadvertently or on purpose by the things that they say and do.
That transitions really into my next point. We see Mouse really struggling with alcoholism in this book. And whether it's alcohol, whether it's different substances, there are a lot of people in our town, in our region, who suffer from substance abuse issues. What are, and you're all professionals, so what are some resources available to people that might be suffering with those things in our community that you might recommend?
Honestly, I don't know about the resources for those who are alcoholics or recovering alcoholics. But about 20 years ago, and so maybe there's something changed, and I pray that it has changed, I was looking for an Alateen resource for some teenagers, and there's nothing available in the area. So I'm prayerful that that has changed, and that there's something for our teenagers who are struggling with alcoholic parents where they can get help.
Four Rivers has several, and I'm sure there are probably some other mental health agencies here locally, but I know Four Rivers has an intensive inpatient as well as an outpatient treatment facilities. We also have just initiated a new program for individuals who have or have suffered a drug overdose. We have, it's called a crisis substance abuse program, whereby when clinicians go into the hospital, if someone has encountered or suffered from an overdose, we try to initially get them treatment. There was follow-ups made by someone there in on that team that tries to encourage them. And I think it kind of goes back to what Keisha had mentioned earlier about awareness. A person, first and foremost, has to be aware that they have a problem. A lot of people are in denial, professionally speaking, because I utilize a substance abuse program, a treatment program, theoretical approach when I counsel individuals with substance addiction issues. But a lot of people are in denial about initially even having, a substance problem. They think that it's the norm. And usually it's until something drastic has to happen for them, to say, hey, maybe I really need to reassess and reevaluate and potentially get some help. But there are resources available. Again, as I stated, Four Rivers has a number of resources available. We do provide case management services for those individuals, as well as other resources if they're in need. A lot of times individuals with substance abuse addiction issues are in need of just regular community-based resources. Some of them aren't able to hold a job or even have housing. So we provide resources that are available to help in those endeavors.
In regards to other resources, of course, like she said, Four Rivers, but I've written down a few others. We also have Centerpoint, Paducah Lifeline Ministries, Behavioral Health Group, and Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm sure that if you call any police department or community service department, they can direct you to those resources, or we have Google now. We can always Google and find out what we have on a local level. But I encourage anyone, because we do have a lot of people who can, I guess, be diagnosed as functioning alcoholics. And that means that they can drink all night and come to work and function at a acceptable capacity. We need to be aware of those as well. And we also need to provide education for those, because, like she said, a lot of people are unaware that they have an issue, and especially the functioning alcoholic. They are, hey, I'm able to get up and go to work, I'm able to keep a job, I'm able to pay my bills, take care of my children, but there's still some deficits that they may not be aware of when it comes to alcohol. So if you know of anyone, I encourage you to just provide the resources. And I think that's important. A lot of times with clients that I've worked with, resources for substance abuse are kind of slim in this area, wouldn't you say? So these are just a few. And also we have issues with these resources that if you need inpatient treatment, it's not available because it's full. So then you have a waiting list. So how can you have someone who has admitted to having a substance abuse issue wait 3 to 4 months before they go into treatment? So you find that they continue the cycle of alcoholism or substance abuse and fail to actually get into treatment. So I just wanted to bring it up, because that's another issue we struggle with in our community, is being able to provide treatment to those who need it right then and there.
Third chance for audience participation. All right. The final story we're going to talk about today takes us full circle back to the character of Mona. So in the opening story of the collection, we hear all about Mona via the eyes of Yolanda. In the final story, we finally get to see the world, or the second to final story, I think. We finally get to see the world through Mona's own eyes, and we learn a little bit more about her than we did the first time around. I think in this story we see that there's definitely, as Mona says in her own words, an emptiness that she's perpetually trying to fill, and never has quite figured out how to do that. What can y'all say about this internal conflict or lack of fulfillment that's going on within Mona, and how that contrasts against the very fulfilling life she seems to project to the world, to her friends, to everyone else around her on the outside? And maybe what was most revealing about that in Mona's actions, or as Wilkinson described her?
All righty. Well, Mona is, I think, the second question that we're going to get to is actually a part of this. Mona is dealing with self-esteem issues. She is looking for love in all the wrong places. And as a result, she really is, she's needing her self-esteem. She's looking for love. And she equates love with her ability to use her body to attract a man. But none of these men stick, because it's all physical lust, not love. And she thinks that she is this firecracker catch. You know, she's an older woman and she's dressing as a younger woman to try to attract every man's attention. She thinks at 40-something she can still do the things that she did at 20-something and have all these men falling out at her feet. But her joy in being able to catch a man is momentary, because once the physical is over, she's left feeling empty because she's seeking love, long-lasting, more than just the fleeting moment, but she doesn't know how to attract that. And that's been from the time that she was a young girl and she realized that her body could attract men. I don't think we had enough information about Mona's upbringing as to how she got to that point, but that's exactly where she is.
So, I think that part of that has to do with socialization. So I know lots of women like Mona. I mean, I know them. They're my friends and things like that. So a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are sometimes socialized to be the desire of someone else, which in turn makes us not take care of ourselves. And so I think that with Mona, she is really trying to do what she knows. And that has been throughout, history, I think. Sometimes in terms of women, it is, well, I look this way and I present myself this way when I'm in front of people, but when I'm by myself, I can't deal with that. And so I think also that because she's with so many people, she doesn't have time to work on herself, because she is always taking care of the needs of other people and trying to satisfy other people. She doesn't do any of that me time and self-fulfillment.
I just want to read this little one statement on page 155. And it states, she's always needed a man, but does not consider herself a whore. Even as a girl, she knew her own magic. She could shame a grown man, cup his eyes in her hands like water, and rub them all over her face and her breast and her hips. So this is Mona's interpretation of herself and her abilities to draw men in for that attention she so thirsts for. She's just so thirsty for that attention. And she learned at an early age that her body was a way of getting it. But unfortunate thing about this, we find that Mona, even seconds after the encounter, she realizes she's still empty. I mean, it's like pouring a pitcher that has nothing in it into a glass. She considers herself empty. I have a question. Would it be the men who had an issue with Mona, or Mona having an issue with the men? And I think we need to kind of look at both of those situations, because she was married, 4 times? 4 times, neither one worked, but you notice love was still on her mind. Did she have an inability to love, and she kept seeing if she could just get to the right person and maybe they would spark something in her? Will be my question.
Well, I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I do know that I don't know that we'd be talking about the same thing if Mona were Mouse. So I think that it's very important that we understand that, yes, I agree, but there are some cases where we have certain standards for women, but the standards for men are somewhat different.
Very much so.
And so if the roles were switched, I don't know that our conversation would be leaning this way.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I was just pointing out the fact that because the standards are very different, they are very different, and they continue to be very different. It's more acceptable for a man to act that way than it is a woman. And Mouse did have issues. I mentioned that Mouse did have issues with relationships, just like Mona does. But we see the fact that Mona sleeps around. They didn't put a lot of emphasis on Mouse sleeping around, but they put a lot of emphasis on Mona because that's who Mona identified herself as, I believe, as one man after another, because I have this ability. And this is my strength. This is what I take pride in. I can grasp a man's attention and hold it for as long as I like. So, and we don't know the background of, what could possibly have happened or led her to think that that was the only thing that she had going for herself. But I was just, trying to introduce a conversation of, was the breakdown from her or from the men? And I think because, and my answer to my own question is, I think that it was her. It was her and her inability to build positive relationships, her inability to connect with a person for whatever reason that may be.
I agree that it was within Mona, and it basically goes to the statement that I'm pretty sure most of us have heard before, that if you don't love yourself, how can you expect anybody else to love you? So she didn't love herself, and maybe that's because she didn't know what love was. And so if you don't know what it is, you're seeking an answer for it. And so she didn't love herself enough to know that she was worth more than what she was doing, performing.
I think that kind of brings us to my last question. I think, as we see Mona in the doctor's waiting room here, she's fixating just as Yolanda was. She's looking at the other women in the waiting room. She's flipping through the magazines and the lingerie ads and the bikini ads and things like that. As Octavia said, she has been socialized to think that what it means to be a woman in society is purely physical. And again, thinking about this in the time frame that the book was set in, how do y'all see that then compared to now? And, do we have things gotten better so that we are less socialized to focus on the physical? Have things gotten worse? And either way, and what can we do to, protect ourselves against that in the 21st century?
I think they've gotten worse because of the media. Television back in the day did not show as much body image. I can remember when married couples in the 60s and 70s on television didn't even sleep in the same bed. May have had the same bedroom, but they didn't sleep in the same bed. And so now, even on daytime television, anything goes. And the image of females, what's sexual or sensual, has become so overt and sometimes over the top. And as a young girl develops, everybody wants to be pretty. Everybody wants to feel like I'm attractive to somebody. So they tend to emulate what they see in the magazines, the popular singers, the television stars. So they go to extremes sometimes just to be what society considers as beautiful. And until we rectify that, it's only going to get worse because it all goes back to self-esteem, self-image.
So I disagree. And I say that because, I have a daughter who is 16, And so for me, when I was that age, beauty was one way. So, you know, images and magazines and things like that did not really have people of color, did not have, you know, I see women, you know, in certain things now. Yes, there are those things where they don't, you know, their bodies are exposed. But then there are also women who wear pantsuits and still look as beautiful, or their hair is not the same way, or things like that. So I do think that beauty standards have in ways sort of are more diversified. So I do think that you have more images of people of color and things like that, people of different sexualities and things like that in ways that we did not have when I was a teenager. So I think that's the case, but I certainly think that we have a long way to go. But I do see that there are strides in the standards of beauty and what they represent.
Well, I say it's worse because you have more exposure to and more opportunities to see the so-called standards of beauty. We were kind of limited in what we could see. And as a result, you have more young people, teenagers and young adults, who have not yet identified or found their niche, who I am internally first, loving inside me. Beauty is from the inside out. They haven't yet found that my beauty doesn't have to be what I look like on the outside. I can be as beautiful on the inside and display that. So that's why I say it's worse, but it has gotten better in the sense that there are more images that you can relate to.
No, I wouldn't mind. Hello. In terms of the book, though, even speaking with now, the correlation from young people then and now, just looking at the book with Mouse, as far as internal beauty and identification and things of that nature, even though you all had a smaller window as far as the imagination and how to present your identity, but as you mentioned before, I mean, I think it still had a hindrance. I don't think it's gotten worse, in agreement with Ms. Lawrence, just because it's only appropriate for what's right now. So the young people now are exercising what we know now. Your young people then may have been exercising what they knew then, only as much as you were allowed to know. As far as Mouse, so Mouse, you said he didn't have much of a family. And then Ms. Keisha said that he was a product of his environment. So him drinking, you know, that wasn't his identity. He didn't always seem very happy with what he succumbed to because that was what he was allowed to know. So I can say that it's gotten worse. I think maybe it's just more projective or projected at a larger angle, specifically just because we've been allowed to go a little more because there have been mistakes in identity, and maybe there are older people in television and things like that who allow things to be pushed because of a lack or something that they missed before. You know, if the homosexual 50-year-old male had what we had today, he would have been a better, you know, 15-year-old homosexual male. Whatever the case may be, that was just an opinion. Not really a question. Sorry.
Thank you.
I would like to add that we do, Melanie and I were working with a group of students, and I think we need to be aware of middle school students, two beautiful young ladies. And when I say beautiful, I mean, to me, I was like, these are some pretty girls. They wanted to be thick. What are you talking about? I want to be thick. I need to get right so I can be thick. To me, they were well developed, no issues, nothing serious, but they still saw something wrong with them. And I think it's important that we start pouring into our children how their beauty might not look like someone else's, you know, but they're still beautiful. I think we forget that we have to continue to push that and pour that. you know, because our children are more sensitive than when Miss Melanie was growing up. We have to acknowledge that more. Instagram, I'm sorry, has been terrible for our children because it paints a picture. It does paint a picture of this is what you should look like and this is what is attractive. But we have to counteract that with you're beautiful just the way you are. And I think the whole movement in our culture with the natural hair has allowed us to be more expressive in who we are as women of color and men also. But we really need to focus on how we present that to our youth. Because I think it saddened me to hear two girls talk about their desire to be thick. You know, back in the day it was, I want to be this big. Now they want to be thick. So, and I think it is by generational and according to what time we're in now. I do agree with that. But we need to just really be cautious on how we talk to our youth.
I agree. I just think that, though, adolescence is that time. You know, I think back to when I was a teenager. You just have that time when you don't think you're at your best self. When you are 14 and 15 and 16 years old, and people do have to reinforce. And I think sometimes I tend to forget that that was a transition that I experienced, but that helped me to become the person that I am now. And so I think it's good for us to also realize that it's important that people are becoming, and they are not where they are going to be. And so it's very important to continue that and make sure that, yes, we enforce those things, but just because somebody is 15 and doesn't feel like they're the most beautiful thing on the planet, that's okay, because eventually they will get there, but it's a process that we have to keep nurturing and making sure that we promote that.
All right, that's a great point to end on. Thank y'all so much for being part of our panel today. I think